The night the blizzard finally broke, 14 people stood shivering in Margaret Caine's snow-buried yard, watching smoke rise steadily from a stone chimney that shouldn't have existed. Below ground, behind her grain silo, was a fully stocked smokehouse they'd all called a waste of time. Now it was the only reason anyone in Polk Township would eat that week. 6 months earlier, Margaret had stood in the Polk County Co-op while 3 men leaned against the seed display and laughed at her. "You're building a what?" Dale Hutchins asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "An underground smokehouse," Margaret repeated, setting a bag of cement mix on the counter. Behind the old silo, Dale exchanged glances with the other men. "Margaret, nobody's built a smokehouse in 40 years. You know they sell meat at the grocery store now, right?" "I'm aware," she said evenly. "Then why in God's name would you dig a hole in January to smoke meat like some kind of pioneer woman?" Margaret counted out cash while the cashier pretended to study the register. "Because systems fail. Trucks stop running. Stores run out. That's what you think." Dale's grin widened. "That civilization's just gonna collapse, and we'll all be jerking venison in our backyards." "I think," Margaret said quietly, "that people who depend entirely on just-in-time delivery are one bad winter away from being very hungry." The laughter followed her all the way to her truck. Margaret Caine was 53, widowed for 8 years, and had farmed the same 200 acres her entire adult life. She wasn't paranoid. She was experienced. She remembered the ice storm of '98, when the power stayed out for 11 days and the grocery store shelves emptied in 3. She remembered neighbors burning furniture to stay warm, remembered the quiet shame on people's faces when they admitted they'd run out of food. She'd promised herself then that she would never be helpless again. The silo had been standing and used since her husband died. 40 feet of rusted steel that most people would have torn down. But Margaret saw potential. The ground behind it sloped gently, perfect for a dugout structure that would stay cool in summer, insulated in winter, and hidden from casual view. She hired a backhoe operator from the next county over, someone who wouldn't talk. Together they excavated a chamber 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 8 feet deep, carving into the hillside so the silo itself formed one wall. Margaret laid down a gravel base, poured a concrete floor, and built stone walls using fieldstone pulled from her own property, mortaring each one carefully to create a sealed, weathertight structure. Then came the chimney, a stone flue rising through the earth and venting beside the silo where it looked like nothing more than an old agricultural feature. Below ground, she installed metal rack salvage from a defunct meatpacking plant, a firebox designed for slow, sustained smoke, and heavy wooden shelves along every wall. By spring, the smokehouse was finished. By summer, she'd begun filling it. Margaret hunted her own deer during season, processed every pound of meat herself, and hummed the salted cuts on racks above smoldering hickory. She cured hams from a neighboring farmer's hocks, smoked whole turkeys, preserved fish from the creek that ran through her back 40. Jars of rendered fat, dried herbs, and vacuum-sealed vegetables lined the shelves. She rotated stock carefully, labeled everything, kept meticulous records. And the whole time, Polk Township watched and whispered. At the diner, someone joked that Margaret was preparing for the apocalypse. At the grain elevator, a man said she'd lost touch with reality after her husband passed. Even Margaret's own sister called one evening, voice careful with concern. "People are talking, Maggie. Let them. They think you've gone strange." Margaret looked out her kitchen window toward the silo, where the hidden chimney rose quietly against the evening sky. "I don't care what they think. You used to. That was before I learned the difference between being liked and being prepared." Her sister sighed. "What are you so afraid of?" Margaret didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, certain. "I'm not afraid. I'm just not stupid enough to believe that comfort is permanent." By October, the smokehouse was fully stocked. 200 pounds of cured meat, smoked sausages, preserved vegetables, rendered fats, dried beans, flour stored in airtight containers. Enough to feed a family for months. Enough to share if necessary. Margaret stood inside the cool, dim chamber one afternoon, checking the cure on a row of hanging hams. The air smelled of smoke and salt and thyme. Above her, footsteps crunched across frozen ground as someone walked past the silo, unaware of what lay beneath. She climbed the stone steps, sealed the heavy wooden door behind her, and covered the entrance with a tarp and stacked firewood, camouflaging it completely. Then she went back to her quiet house and waited. Because Margaret Caine understood something the rest of Polk Township had forgotten. Winter in Kansas wasn't a season. It was a test. And when it finally came in earnest, only the people who'd prepared beforehand would pass. The forecast changed on a Tuesday in late November, subtle enough that most people missed it entirely. But Margaret noticed. She always noticed. The Weather Service upgraded their winter storm watch to a warning, then 12 hours later issued a rare blizzard alert for the entire region. A massive Arctic system was stalling over the Great Plains instead of moving through. Sustained winds above 50 miles per hour. Temperatures dropping below zero. Snowfall measured in feet, not inches. Margaret filled every water container in her house, brought in extra firewood, checked her generator, and made one final trip to the Smokehouse to verify her inventory. Everything was ready. Polk Township, meanwhile, made grocery runs and complained about the timing. Right before Thanksgiving, someone muttered in the checkout line. Typical. The storm arrived Thursday evening, 3 hours earlier than predicted. Snow fell so thick it erased the horizon within minutes. Wind hit like a physical force, bending trees and tearing loose anything not anchored down. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in 2 hours. By midnight, the power failed. Margaret woke to silence, the kind that only comes when every electric hum dies at once. She pulled on layers, lit oil lamps, and started a fire in her wood stove. Outside, the wind screamed across the plains with a sound like tearing metal. The storm didn't stop. It intensified. For 3 days, snow fell without pause. Drifts climbed past windows, buried vehicles, erased roads completely. The wind never dropped below 40 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontal, creating whiteout conditions so severe that stepping outside meant risking disorientation within seconds. And the cold deepened. -15, -25. Cold that cracked trees and froze diesel in fuel lines. Margaret monitored her battery radio, listening as emergency services announced road closures, then suspended operations entirely. No plows could move. No ambulances could respond. Polk Township was completely cut off. On the 4th day, her neighbor appeared. Tom Bevins knocked so quietly Margaret almost missed it over the wind. When she opened the door, snow exploded inward and Tom stumbled through. Ice crusted across his face. "Generator died," he said through chattering teeth. House dropped below freezing overnight. Margaret pulled him inside, closed the door against the wind. "Your family. Sent them to my brother's place in town before it got bad. I stayed to watch the livestock." He looked hollowed out, exhausted. "Lost 2 calves already. Can't keep the barn warm enough." Margaret poured hot coffee, watched him wrap his hands around the cup. "You can't stay at your place? Pipes burst this morning. No water, no heat." He met her eyes. "I remembered you built that smokehouse. Thought maybe." He stopped, embarrassed. "Thought maybe you'd have some food to spare. I can pay you. You don't need to pay me." Margaret stood, pulled on her coat. "Come on." She led him outside into wind, so fierce it stole their breath. They fought their way toward the silo, Margaret navigating by memory more than sight. Behind the structure, she cleared snow from the hidden entrance, pulled back the tarp, and opened the heavy wooden door. Warm air rose from below, carrying the scent of smoke and cured meat. Tom stared into the lit chamber like he was seeing something impossible. My God! They descended stone steps into the underground room. Oil lamps cast steady light across rows of hanging meat, shelves packed with preserved food, the banked firebox radiating gentle heat that the thick walls held and distributed evenly. Tom turned slowly, taking it all in. "You weren't just preparing. You were building something that actually works." "Yes." "How much food do you have down here?" Margaret scanned the racks, doing quick calculations. "Enough to feed 20 people for 2 months. Longer if we're careful." Tom's voice dropped. "The whole township's in trouble, Margaret. Most folks used up their generator fuel by day 2. Nobody stocked up properly because nobody expected this." Margaret had expected exactly this. But she didn't say it. "We should tell people," Tom said. "Tell them what? That you have food. That you have a warm place." He gestured at the chamber. "Margaret, people are going to start getting desperate." She'd thought about this scenario many times, had played it out in her mind during all those months of building and stocking. The question wasn't whether to help. It was how to help without creating chaos. "We tell people carefully," she said finally. "We bring them here in small groups. We ration everything. And we make sure everyone understands this isn't a free supply. It's emergency reserves that have to last." Tom nodded slowly. "You're going to save lives. I'm going to share what I prepared." Margaret began filling a bag with smoked meat, dried vegetables, and preserved fat. "Starting with you. Get this to your brother's house. Make sure your family eats." Tom took the bag, heavy with food that would keep his family fed for a week. "What do I tell people when they ask where it came from?" "Tell them the truth." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Tell them it came from the woman they laughed at." By the 7th day of the storm, 14 people crowded into Margaret's underground smokehouse, sitting on overturned crates and salvaged chairs, eating warm stew made from smoked venison and preserved vegetables, while the blizzard continued its assault overhead. They'd come in groups of 2 and 3, fighting through waist-deep snow, following Tom Bevins, or others Margaret had quietly sent word to. Families whose homes had become uninhabitable. Elderly neighbors whose heating systems had failed. A young couple with a newborn who had burned through their emergency supplies by day 4. Margaret had taken them all in. She'd organized everything with the same methodical precision she'd used to build the smokehouse. Sleeping shifts on the benches and floor. Ration meals twice daily. Strict rules about conserving lamp oil and managing the firebox. Everyone contributed, hauling snow to melt for water, maintaining ventilation, helping prepare food. Dale Hutchins sat in the corner, the same man who'd mocked her at the co-op. He'd arrived on day 5, nearly hypothermic after his furnace died. He hadn't said much since, just worked quietly at whatever tasks Margaret assigned, avoiding her eyes. On the 8th day, the wind finally began to ease. The snow thinned. Through the small ventilation shaft, they could see patches of gray sky instead of solid white. Margaret climbed above ground for the first time in 24 hours. The world looked apocalyptic. Snow drifts reached the roof of her barn. Her truck was buried completely. The road had vanished beneath a white expanse that stretched unbroken to the horizon. But across that expanse, a faint mechanical sound grew louder. Snowplows. Heavy equipment from a county. The township was being reached. Below ground, people began gathering their things, talking about checking on their homes, assessing damage. Margaret started dividing up remaining food stores, packing bags for each family to take with them. Dale approached her as she worked. "Margaret." She looked up. "I was wrong." His voice was rough. "About everything I said. About the way I—" He stopped, started again. "You saved my life. You saved all of us. And I spent 6 months making you the town joke." Margaret sealed another bag, handed it to him. "You weren't wrong to question it. You were wrong to mock it. There's a difference. I know that now." She met his eyes directly. "Do you understand why I built this, Dale? Really understand?" He glanced around the stone chamber, at the preserved food that had kept them alive, at the design that had held steady while everything above ground failed. "Because you knew what could happen, and you took responsibility for surviving it." "No." Margaret shook her head. "I built this because I couldn't control whether the storm came, only whether I'd be ready when it did." Over the next week, as roads were cleared and power was slowly restored, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Polk Township had been hit harder than anywhere else in the region. 11 homes sustained major damage from burst pipes and collapsed roofs. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in livestock losses. 3 people hospitalized for hypothermia and frostbite. But no deaths. Not a single one. The story spread quickly. News crews came, drawn by reports of a woman who had fed half a township from an underground smokehouse nobody knew existed. Margaret refused interviews, but others talked freely. They showed reporters the hidden chamber, explained how Margaret had organized everything, described the food that had sustained them. The footage went viral. Within days, Margaret's smokehouse was being analyzed by disaster preparedness experts, featured in agricultural journals, studied by emergency management agencies. She ignored all of it. Instead, she restocked, processed more meat, refilled the shelves, prepared the few things that needed fixing. Because the storm had passed, but winter wasn't over. And the lesson she'd spent 6 months trying to teach people have finally been learned, not through words, but through survival. On a clear Saturday in December, Margaret stood in the co-op buying salt and curing supplies. The store was quiet, Saturday morning slow. Dale was there, picking up fence supplies. He nodded to her respectfully. "Margaret." "Dale." Planning another batch? Always. He smiled slightly. You know, I've been thinking about building something similar. Smaller, just for my family. Would you be willing to show me how? Margaret considered him. You prepared to do it right? Even if people think you're crazy? I think I'm done caring what people think. He paused. You taught me that. She nodded once. Sunday afternoon. Bring a notebook. By spring, 7 families in Polk Township had begun construction on their own storage systems. Margaret helped with each one, sharing techniques and hard-won knowledge. The Township Civil Defense Committee asked her to lead emergency preparedness training. The County Extension Office requested her Smokehouse plans for their disaster readiness program. She agreed to all of it, not because she wanted recognition, but because the work mattered. Because the difference between surviving and not surviving often came down to decisions made long before the crisis arrived. On a warm April evening, Margaret stood in her smokehouse, checking the cure on a fresh batch of ham. The chamber smelled the same as always, smoke and salt and stone. The same as it had during those desperate days when 14 people had crowded inside, grateful for warmth and food and shelter. She ran her hand along the stone wall she'd built with her own labor, feeling the solid permanence of it. Above ground, spring was arriving. Snow melting, fields thawing, life returning to normal rhythms. But Margaret knew better than most that normal was temporary, that comfort was fragile, that the difference between catastrophe and survival was often just one person willing to prepare when everyone else believed it was unnecessary. She climbed the stone steps, sealed the door, and walked back toward her house under a sky finally clear of winter's threat. The smokehouse would be ready when it was needed again, because Margaret Caine understood something that no amount of mockery could ever change. Being right after a disaster was worth enduring every laugh before it.